And the backdrop of all of this is potentially double-digit tariffs that could completely wreck the businesses of Germany and also France. And so the question mark is how the EU navigates both the security relationship with Donald Trump, who, remember, is very much a NATO skeptic, and how he also tries to put pressure on Ukraine to potentially accept a difficult settlement that could affect Europe more than affect the United States. And also the other question mark is whether or not he really will impose those 10% or so tariffs on goods coming to the EU.
France is teetering on the edge of turmoil over a budget rail. Prime Minister Michel Barnier wants spending cuts and tax rises, but far-right leader Marine Le Pen is not having any of it, and she's threatened to topple the government. Well, joining us now to explain what on earth is going on is Nina dos Santos, broadcaster and former CNN anchor. Nina, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Alexis.
Nina, it's been a very tricky time for France. President Emmanuel Macron has had to install Michel Barnier as his prime minister, but there seems to be trouble in the government when it comes to the budget. What's going on?
Well, essentially, what we're expecting this week is Michel Barnier, the Prime Minister, who, by the way, comes from the party that was the least popular in these French parliamentary elections over the summer. He's trying to push forward budgetary measures that would see spending cuts of about 60 billion euros, also tax hikes and changes to social security that in a country like France, which is also being rocked by a cost of living crisis, just like we are here in the UK, are extremely unpopular. And that means that both the far right, Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party, that has a kind of sword of Damocles hanging over this current government's head, and also the far left are united in trying to bring him down. They say that they could push forward a vote of no confidence if he tries to use a constitutional measure to push through some of these unpopular budgetary measures in the next week or so without putting it to a vote. And that's really what hangs in the balance. The question is whether or not it's a game of chicken yet again, because we know that Marine Le Pen is quite good at these political games of chicken, and whether or not she's made the calculation that she might end up with egg on her face, proverbially speaking, if the government does fall and France is economically worse off here on from that point of view, or whether this could be her moment to create chaos and try and get not just Barnier to resign, but put pressure on Emmanuel Macron to precipitate the 2027 presidential elections and bring them forward.
Nina, if she is successful in aligning with the far left and voting the government down, what happens next? Is it a question of President Macron trying to find yet another prime minister, or do the French go back to the polls?
Well, this is where it comes back to this question of her political calculation that we don't really know which way she's going to lean on, because the problem is that France is halfway through a parliamentary electoral cycle, but constitutionally, because Emmanuel Macron called those snap elections in the summer, he can't actually call another election to vote back in a new parliament, a new Assemblée Nationale, nominate a new prime minister for another year. So France, if indeed Marine Le Pen does bring down the government with or without the other parties, what she could end up with is having created a situation where there's complete political gridlock. And then the question is, will Macron really be forced to resign? Now, constitutionally, again, he can sit pretty until 2027 when his last term runs to an end. He can't run thereafter. But the reality is that the polls are putting pressure on him, because there was a poll just this week in France that showed that he was so deeply unpopular after this ill-fated decision to call a snap election that's fractured the political system in France over the summer, that about half of French people polled thought, really, irrespective of constitutional rules, he should go now.
Gosh. Nina, I was wondering whether we can take a broader look of Europe just briefly, because we have elections in Germany coming up in February. France is looking slightly unstable right now, depending on what happens with this budget vote. What is that doing to Europe as a whole?
There's a real question over whether or not Europe is facing another Eurozone crisis akin to the 2008 Eurozone crisis that was in smaller, less financially crucial members of the European Union. Arguably, the stakes are much, much higher now than when Greece needed to be bailed out, Portugal, Ireland, and other countries. We're talking about the two most important seminal members of the European Union being on the brink, not just of political chaos, but also economic chaos as well. So you just heard there about how France is wrangling over this budget. The reason why why Michel Barnier, beg your pardon, wants to bring forward these sort of austerity measures in France, where he wants to cut 60 billion off the budget, is because France's yawning deficit, it's plus 6% and rising,
I
is
lost output.
twice the actual limit of the EU. So that's one problem. So France is economically weak, and that could cause a bond market crisis. But then, of course, we've got Germany, which now has seen its government crumble and is heading to early elections in February. Its business model is on the brink, and so is its political system as well.
And of course, with the incoming Trump government, it's not an ideal time for Europe to be having a crisis.
No, absolutely not. And the big backdrop to all of this is that everybody's panicking, not just because they don't know how their relationship with Donald Trump will be faring. You know, as I was saying before, he's going to be dealing in a few years' time with different leaders of France and different leaders of Germany. But the other issue is that, yes, okay, Ursula von der Leyen's got a second term at the helm of the European Commission, but the priorities of the EU have completely changed. Gone have are all of those, focuses on green initiatives. Now the focus is on defense, economic prosperity, and also coping with migration issues that could get worse if there's a bad end and settlement to the Ukraine war as well, with a wave of people heading over to places like Germany and France from the east as well. And in the backdrop of all of this, is potentially double-digit tariffs that could completely wreck the businesses of Germany and also France. And so the question mark is how the EU navigates both the security relationship with Donald Trump, who, remember, is very much a NATO skeptic, and how he also tries to put pressure on Ukraine to potentially accept a difficult settlement that could affect Europe more than affect the United States. And also the other question mark is whether or not he really will impose those 10% or so tariffs on goods coming to the EU. We're already seeing people like the head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, who, being a French woman herself, former head of the IMF, is acutely aware of the peril that France financially, if its bonds continue to spike from here on, could cause for the Eurozone. She's already started to try and verbally placate Donald Trump. She's said to European companies, well, you should really perhaps think about buying more goods from the United States. We're probably going to hear similar messages from Ursula von der Leyen when the EU kicks off its next commission, which will start just on the 1st of December, so as of next week.
Nina, as ever, thank you so much for giving us all this time. Brilliant to look at the bigger picture in Europe at the moment. Nina Santos, their broadcaster and former CNN anchor. Coming up, we're going to be getting an international reaction to yesterday's assisted dying vote. Plus, we've been having a bit of a musical face-off between Pink Floyd and Michael Jackson. So we've been asking you for your favourite tracks. Nigel texted in with this.